Very exciting panel. Welcome back. We have Napoleon Legend, hip hop artist, Brooklyn based, always traveling the world, speaking multiple languages. Just saw him post a clip of himself in a documentary like 10 years ago. That was cute to see young Napoleon. That's on your Instagram. And we have Rose Adams, who is a political reporter who has been with The Intercept and covered New York City politics and news at the Brooklyn paper in AM New York. We got some New York news today, so I'm excited to have you guys on. All right, let's just start off with what I find. Like, I don't know why I've looked at this picture like 9,000 times and I've never, but I just think it's the funniest thing in the world. And I know people are coming after me saying I'm pro arson, but Jesus Christ, like Fox News, the war on Christmas has come for them. Let's post this. Just something to laugh about. Oh, look it. The tree in front of Fox News is on fire. Supposedly, I think it's 2 men now have been apprehended for lighting the Christmas tree on fire. You know, it's dangerous because there's glass, on there and they pop and explode and it's like shrapnel. But it's also really funny. So 2 things can be true at once. I'm not really here to ask you your thoughts about it. I just wanted to laugh. But if you have any thoughts on the tree being on fire and the war on Christmas, please.
I kind of feel bad laughing about it, but it's just making me laugh seeing that image for some reason. I guess it's God's fury. Giving back the Christmas tree. Yeah.
Well, like the funniest part is I'm looking at my Instagram and I get these trolls basically who've seen me on Fox News or other like conservatives that I've, debated in the past who are like, I can't believe you'd be pro arson. I'm like, I can't believe you don't defend, when Black men are killed. How about that? It's unreal. Okay. Anyways.
Well, obviously God doesn't approve of Fox News right now. It's burning Christmas trees.
But they're gonna pivot and they're gonna say it's the war on Christmas. It's right. I mean, I would be surprised if they did it. That's how long term. I mean, the Koch brothers probably had this plan like 20 years ago. They're like redistricting, abortion rights, immigration, and the war on Christmas.
It's a false flag event.
False flag event. All right, they're gonna be riots tomorrow. They're gonna say that the riots on the street all over the war on Christmas. On our show, we actually haven't covered Cuomo that much, which is crazy given everything. But Chris Cuomo, since last week, has resigned from CNN, and every day there's a new piece of information that's coming out. He resigned from CNN. He was making $6 million a year. He had a 3-year contract with CNN, and now he's at absolute war with CNN. Is going to sue them for $18 million, basically his 3-year contract. He stepped down from Sirius XM where he had a show. I don't know what happened there. I used to work at Sirius XM, so I'm really curious how that happened. And then HarperCollins, which was publishing his book, has decided that they're not going to continue his contract for his book. And it's all based on essentially, what happened. Letitia James unveiled through the Attorney General's investigation of Andrew Cuomo that Chris Cuomo was advising much more than he even said, advising the Cuomo administration. And I'm not going to say this is not uncommon, I think, in the news industry. I think a lot of folks do favors for folks, and that's kind of how access journalism is created, is built. But there were sexual whether it was assault or harassment allegations, we really don't know because it hasn't been disclosed, but there's something much, much worse. So my question is not the reaction. I mean, I think we all get what's happening right now, but is he going away? Do you think that this is the end, or is this, or maybe there's like a new lane that's being carved out right now where it's the canceled Democrats, because they still have constituencies. They're still popular. I looked at the comments. It was Andrew Cuomo's birthday yesterday, and I was like, all these people still love him. What is going on? What do you think, Napoleon?
I think he, like you said, the word cancel and stuff like that, I think he could ride on that, like he was being canceled. And since he's one of those in your face, as I say it how it is, I don't need to have the same decorum as the regular news person. I think there's a way for him to like reinvent himself in a way. And it's not going to be what it was when the platforms on CNNs or whatever. But I think he still has enough, like you said, of an audience and people who like him and follow him for him to find another lane for himself. I don't think he's done. I don't think he's ever going to be anything close to what he was, but I think he's still probably going to be at the periphery doing something, with that audience if he's smart enough to keep going. But I think he has that shamelessness to him that allows him to like keep going from something like that, which some people wouldn't be able to recover it in any type of way.
Rose, whether or not he keeps going is one thing, but is this potentially an opportunity for a space in democratic politics, whether it's center left politics, to really seize in on what you're seeing is actually like there are a lot of normie Democrats who feel really uncomfortable with the rate of canceling folks has gone. I mean, if you talk to voters on the ground, maybe it's not our folks, but there are a lot of older voters who feel like woke is being used as a weapon, and like we're not into it.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. And it's interesting how it factors into politics now. I mean, we've been talking about wokeness a lot in sort of a more social environment. And there's been obviously instances in politics too, like, where it's come into play before, and there's definitely been sort of a cancellation. But I do feel like all cancellations are mostly, for the most part, temporary. I mean, I'm sure in enough time we'll see them both reemerge, both Chris and Andrew reemerge in some capacity. I mean, I agree, not to the degree that they were before, but in becoming power players. I mean, we see Jeffrey Toobin's back online.
Jesus
it
Christ,
only
man.
takes a few, and everything is relative to the degree of severity. So yeah, that would take a few months. This will take a few years. But in terms of sort of center left politics, I think that is something that definitely needs to be grappled with. And like, how do you address issues within a party without having it be sort of you're in or you're out? And I don't really know how to go about that. I mean, I think the Scott Stringer issue is actually an interesting example
Ran
of
for
that.
mayor. He's the comptroller.
Scott Stringer, the New York City comptroller, ran for mayor and was accused of sexual assault by a former volunteer on his 2002 campaign, so 10 years ago. And, he was immediately canceled. So this is kind of another example of that happening. And he was sort of center left, and he was immediately, kind of just tossed to the side. And he was a progressive front runner, and everyone withdrew their endorsements of him before there was really any sort of corroboration or investigation into it. And I think a lot of people were frustrated by that. There wasn't enough due process. I mean, this is different with Cuomo because there really was an investigation and due process. But it is, and I think afterwards, a lot of people came forward and said, in Scott Stringer's example, we regret. Some people came forward. I know this one politician, Jamal Bowman, came forward and said, I would kind of regret immediately withdrawing my endorsement without any sort of just kind of bandwagoning it. So this is a question I think we really have to grapple with in some way as progressives, very online progressives that, because Twitter is such a fuel for cancellation. How we can go about this sort of issue. But I think at least the Cuomo's case is pretty cut and dry in my mind.
And, and I'll just add to that because I feel, I've seen it especially in New York politics where sometimes progressives don't understand that the information they're getting is from the right wing and it's not actually vetted and like pure. I wouldn't say that with the case of Scott Stringer. We can't know for sure, but there are I've seen multiple stories on folks that come out and are later debunked, or you start to understand a little bit in more depth where the stories came from or who planted them. And by then it's like somebody's been affected. Or on the other hand, you look at someone like Lindsey Boylan, whose life has really been affected. She's run twice and it has absolutely affected her. The harassment, the smears, you see Malatrust, the Chancellor SUNY, who is being defended right now. And he was very much part of the strategy to smear and combat Lindsey Boylan. And she has to deal with those repercussions as well as everybody who's been, whether it's sexually harassed or assaulted from the administration. And, what are we as a society doing to make sure that their voices are supported and their careers are supported? Because that is your life. That's your livelihood. It's your family's livelihood.
Right.
I want to shift gears just a little bit because yesterday. I don't like. No one seems to be really talking about it, but it's kind of a big deal. The House passed a $768 billion defense policy bill, and hey, they actually did more than what President Biden was calling for. So, congratulations, defense industry. It's a pretty intense bill, very, very complicated. But I want to highlight a couple of quotes from this New York Times article. So this is from the article itself, saying also missing from the final legislation was a provision passed by the House that directed Mr. Biden to impose sanctions over the Nord Stream 2, an undersea gas pipeline running from Russia to Germany that lawmakers fear will give Moscow undue leverage over Central Europe. And then we'll get to another quote in a second. Josh Fox comes on our show a lot, and Josh Fox is, of course, the director behind Gasland and Gasland 2, who I would say mainstreamed the fight against, fracking and natural gas, and was a big part of the fight in Europe to ban fracking. And there are all these loopholes, and even in New York State, where we've banned fracking, which he helped lead that effort too, there are loopholes. But he's always said since 2016 that the Putin anger towards Hillary was really came down to this fight over pipelines, and specifically in the Arctic. And you go back and like, oh my gosh, this does seem very much that's what's happening. And so he's been beating the drum on this for a long time, saying Russiagate is sort of a thing, but it's not in the way that the Democrats are framing it, because the Democrats don't want to be seen in this like oil war with Russia. It's not a great policy. Yeah, I mean, foreign policy is complicated and has a big impact in our lives. But Rose, I mean, are we like in this like weird quiet war when we talk about a Cold War? I mean, like, to me, that's the Cold War. It's really over oil and gas.
Totally, yeah. And looking at that whole situation with it just seems that this could be really ripe for a big conflict. I mean, the pipeline is clearly not just an issue in terms of environmentalism. It's also, this a power play for Russia to both, take more control over the Ukraine, since the Ukraine won't have, I guess, access to the fees that they normally would, because the pipeline goes through their country. So this is both a power play to gain access over, Ukraine, and then also to just become a huge power player in terms of having the gas in and being able to distribute gas in Europe, just giving Russia all this power. And we've seen during COVID how much Europe sort of needs that. So it's, the U.S. has already come out against it a while ago and been like, anti the pipeline and having, going to sanction it heavily. But it just seems like there's nowhere to go but up in terms of escalation. So it definitely is a worrisome thing. And it's going to be interesting to follow, but it's hard to imagine that, as the U.S. sanctions get more intense, and that in turn makes the Russians more angry, that this wouldn't become a, potentially Cold War-like scenario.
Right. Napoleon, what I find interesting about this and sort of the moves by Russia and some of Putin's, and when I say Russia, I really mean Putin. So I know people get really intense about this. So the Putin government and his allies the political side of this is destabilizing countries in Europe through pushing candidates that lean more fascistic and more quote unquote populist. And so you're seeing, especially in Eastern Europe, a lot more of that rise, and it's creating conditions, or the conditions I guess existed, but creating conditions where there can be a destabilization of parts of Europe, whether it's Brexit or which there's a direct role in interference. I mean, foreign interference happens everywhere. I get it, but if the goal is for a pipeline and more natural gas, and the pathway to that is through essentially pushing fascism, it's a pretty scary situation. I mean, you spend a lot of time in Europe. Like, how are the conditions on the ground right now?
I mean, it's definitely scary, and in particular, I've been actually was part of a new show, on French TV, and they were talking about how France politics is becoming even more right wing, and there's a lot of right wing candidates, and there's rival right wing candidates with Le Pen and Zemmour. So I'm seeing more and more countries in Europe, just like in America too. It's like everything seems to be leaning towards the right. So I definitely think it's a trend going on, and it's definitely a concern. And if people like Russia and forces like that are underhandedly kind of pulling the strings or pulling along because they want to destabilize as their intention, um, we're heading towards, you know, like very, very sketchy, a sketchy future when it comes to that. You know, it's going to be very, very complex. And I think the tensions are just going to keep slowly rising until I don't know what happens.
I want to read the second quote from this article that stood out to me. Quote, I support having by far the strongest military in the world and the good paying defense jobs in my district that protect our troops, said Representative Andy Levine, a Democrat from Michigan. But, he continues, I cannot support ever increasing military spending in the face of so much human need across our country. That's like classic, politician speak. But what I find so powerful about that is he actually narrows in on what creates the conditions for the right wing to spread. And, obviously military spending and government spending is a message that libertarians and some people on the right or anti-establishment like to hone in on. But the conditions of not putting your money into your own people and not paying for healthcare and not having a fully funded education system and infrastructure. And we're sitting here fighting over building roads right now with a fellow Democrat. But, we have no problem throwing out, all these contracts to defense contractors. I think, he's obviously onto something, but just to pivot back to the rise of fascism, Rose, how much of that is the root of what's happening right now?
The rise in fascism, it's interesting to think about how, this is all sort of happening at the same time. You have Russia or Putin's government kind of with fascist tendencies rising up in an environment, not necessarily locally, but in a world environment that is kind of more sympathetic towards right wing tendencies. And it's interesting also to think about how right wing means something a little bit different in every country.
Right.
I think in Europe, it's definitely very race and motivated, very motivated by the fact that there's been a big refugee crisis and a real backlash to that. And that's 100%, not necessarily the refugee crisis, but in America, there is a big race element too. But there's no doubt that there's this rising kind of right-wing fervor. It's interesting. It's hard to imagine. I don't really have any answers to why. I'd be interested to hear if you guys have any theories as to why this is happening now. Maybe it's something about how, the conditions, it's just sort of a sort of pendulum swing. That could be it. But, kind of just quickly back on the military spending thing, though, we just exited a 20-year war. And the defense bill is bigger than it was. It's just, and we have in part because of the new technology that they need. Like, why do we need that?
Right.
Anyway,
I was on the Hill. I was on Rising yesterday morning or 2 days ago, and we were talking about the satellite fight, the space laser fight that's happening right now between China, Russia, and the U.S. and how that is the new, that's the new arms race. And my basic question was, how many do you need in space? Like, and their argument was, well, China and Russia are jamming up our satellites, so we need more satellites. And they're creating these like space lasers that block things. I'm like, what on earth? This is the fight. And the implications still, by the way, affect human lives. So if we're sitting here saying, well, at least, there aren't soldiers out there. No, if you disrupt a power grid, as we've seen multiple times, how does that affect somebody's ability to survive, to be able to access water? If you're, on a 15-story apartment, and you're elderly, you can't move, you don't have water. Like, people need to understand like how this stuff impacts their lives. And that is something I think the Biden administration could do a much better job of explaining. Napoleon, final thoughts on everything. You got the floor.
I feel as if even reading that article, that either they're trying to stoke fear in us, making us believe that it's necessary for them to spend that much because of the threats, the imminent threats, or American is like seriously scared too. I feel like America with a capital A somehow understands that it's military, it's right to exist, or without it, it wouldn't be the America in that in their sense, in the way we know America being. So it's I think there's a lot of fear in the air, and they don't want to lose their position in geopolitics.
Well, space lasers, if they happen to interfere with Elon Musk, I'll just leave it there when he's in space. All right, guys, you are awesome. Thanks for joining today. Thanks for everybody for watching and listening. Make sure to check us out on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. Support the show. That is how we make this thing work.